All right, so the first cam we'll be performing is a straight leg internal rotation of the hip. I would instruct the patient to lay face up, supine on the table, and I would basically have them actively internally rotate. I would show them the movement, keeping your leg straight, internally rotate the hip as far as they can, and back, and perform the same thing on the opposite leg. Internally rotate as far as you can. All right, the next cam we'll be performing is the straight leg, 30 degrees of abduction and internal rotation. So again, I would have the patient lay face up, supine on the table. I would take their leg and place them in about 30 degrees of abduction. I'm taking the weight of the leg, sort of supporting the ankle. From this position, I would have the patient internally rotate as far as they can, and back. And then I would perform the same thing on the other side, 30 degrees of abduction, supporting the ankle. I've got the weight of the leg, and they're actively internally rotating the hip. Good. All right, the next cam we'll be performing is straight leg, 30 degrees of hip abduction and 30 degrees of hip flexion. Patient is laying supine. I will passively abduct their leg to 30 degrees and actively or passively flex their hip at about 30 degrees as well. From this position, supporting their leg, I have the weight of their leg. I'm going to instruct the patient to internally rotate from the hip as far as they can on the opposite side. Next one we'll be performing is the straight leg of just 30 degrees of hip flexion. So patient is laying supine. I'm going to passively flex the patient's hip to 30 degrees and ask the patient to internally rotate as far as they can from the hip, supporting their leg, the weight of their leg, and perform this on the other side. Next cam we're going to be performing is the straight leg, 30 degrees of hip abduction and 30 degrees of hip flexion. Cam I'll be performing is the straight leg, 30 degrees. The next cam I'll be performing is the straight leg, 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of adduction. Patient will be laying supine on the table. I will passively bring them into 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of adduction, and ask them to actively internally rotate from the hip as far as they can, supporting the weight of the leg. I would then perform this on the other side. Next cam we'll be performing is active external rotation of the hip. I would have the patient laying supine on the table, and I would ask them to actively externally rotate from the hip as far as they can. And then we would perform and compare on the other side. The cam we'll be performing is the straight leg, 30 degrees of abduction and external rotation. Patient is laying supine on the table. I'm going to move them out into 30 degrees of abduction. And from this position, supporting the weight of the leg, I'm going to ask the patient to externally rotate from the hip as far as they can go, making sure it's not coming from the ankle and all from the hip. I would then compare to the other side. Performing is 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of abduction, and external rotation of the hip. Patient is laying supine on the table. I'm going to passively abduct their hip to 30 degrees, flex the hip to 30 degrees, and from this position, supporting the weight of the leg, I'm going to ask the patient to externally rotate from the hip, supporting the foot and the ankle as they do, and bring back down and compare to the other. Next cam we'll be performing is a patient's straight leg, 30 degrees of hip flexion and external rotation. So I'll ask the patient to lay supine on the table. I'm going to passively move their leg up into 30 degrees of hip flexion, and from this position, supporting the patient's leg, I'm going to have them actively externally rotate from the hip as far as they can go, and bring it back down. Compare that to the other. Next cam I'll be performing is a straight leg, 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of adduction with external rotation. I'll have the patient lay supine on the table. I'm going to passively bring them up into 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of adduction, and from this position, supporting the patient's leg, I'm going to ask them to externally rotate from the hip as far as they can, and then bring them back down and compare that to the other. Next cam we're going to be performing is we're going to be assessing hip internal rotation from 90 degrees of knee flexion and hip flexion. I'll have the patient lay supine on the table, and I will have them actively bring their leg into 90 degrees of knee flexion as well as 90 degrees of hip flexion. From this position, I'm going to take the weight of the leg, and I'm going to instruct the patient to actively internally rotate from the hip as far as they can go, supporting the weight of their leg. The next cam I'll be performing is hip external rotation from 90 degrees of knee flexion and 90 degrees of hip flexion. Patient will be laying supine on the table to start. I'm going to have them actively bring their leg into 90 degrees of knee flexion and 90 degrees of hip flexion. I'm going to then take the weight of the leg and instruct the patient to externally rotate from the hip as far as they can. Bring the leg back down and compare to the other side. All right, the next cam we'll be performing is knee extension with 90 degrees of hip flexion. For this cam, we'll have the patient laying supine on the table. I'm going to have the patient actively bring themselves up into 90 degrees of hip flexion, 90 degrees of knee flexion. From this position, I'm going to take the weight of the lower leg supporting at the heel and the back of the knee. Here, I will then ask the patient to extend at the knee as far as they can, and returning to neutral and assessing and comparing to the other side. The next cam we'll be performing is hip extension with external rotation and 90 degrees of knee flexion. So I will have the patient laying prone on the table. I'll instruct the patient to actively flex their knee to 90 degrees, slightly abduct their hip. We're going to bring them into external rotation, actively into external rotation. And from this position, I'll ask the patient to actively bring themselves into hip extension as far as they can, maintaining that external rotation, and then compare that. And we're going to be performing is hip extension with internal rotation and 90 degrees flexion. Have the patient laying prone on the table. I'll ask the patient to actively flex their knee to 90 degrees, slightly abduct. We're going to go ahead and have them actively internally rotate their hip as far as they can go, and then from this position we're going to ask them to go into hip extension, maintaining that internal rotation of the hip. Return the leg to neutral and compare to the other side. Alright, the next cam we'll be performing is active hip extension at 90 degrees of flexion. So for this cam I'll have the patient laying prone on the table. I'm going to have them actively flex their knee up to 90 degrees and slightly abduct their leg. From this position, I'm going to just place my hand on the sacrum to make sure that they're not extending through their lumbar spine, and I'm going to have the patient extend through their hip actively as far as they can, and returning to normal, and then comparing it to the other side. What we'll be performing is hip external rotation with 90 degrees of flexion, and so I'll have the patient lay prone for this cam. We will have the patient actively flex their knee to 90 degrees and slightly abduct the thigh, and from this position I will have the patient actively externally rotate, just sort of guiding the leg down as far as they can, return to neutral, and assess on the other side. Alright, the next cam we'll be performing is hip external rotation. Performing is internal rotation with 90 degrees of hip flexion. In this cam, we'll have the patient lay prone on the table. I will have the patient actively bring their knee up to 90 degrees and slightly abduct their leg. And from here, I will have them actively go into internal rotation as far as they can. Bring the leg back down and assess on the other side. The next cam we'll be performing is knee flexion with hip flexion. So part one, have the patient lay supine on the table. The patient is going to actively bring their hip and their knee to 90 degrees. From this position, I'll instruct the patient to bring their heel towards the back of their leg as far as they can. We'll return back to the 90-90 position. We'll internally rotate the tibia and have the patient pull the heel towards the back of the leg again. Return back to 90-90, externally rotate the tibia, and bring the heel to the back of the leg. And then compare that to the next cam we'll be performing is the hip flexion, abduction, and external rotation. I would have the patient lay supine on the table. I would have the patient then take the leg we're assessing and bring the outside of the ankle, the lateral malleolus, up below the opposite patella. I would support the knee and then instruct the patient to let his or her knee fall down towards the table as far as they can go. And I would then return the patient back to neutral and perform on the other side.